Welcome back, everyone. This is our final section of the conference here. We have a roundtable rather than a presentation. And what we're trying to do is to gather together a good number of our contributors from the conference, just to talk about some of the themes that have run through the different papers, topics that have recurred in our conversation. And we want to think, especially now, about the future directions in which research on theological genealogies of modernity might go. What would it be profitable to try and do after the discussions that we've had to this point? So when Pui and I approached Oxford University to look for funding for this conference, we told them that this was a sort of pump priming exercise. So we said we were going to try to set up things that would happen in the future. And based on the discussion that has happened so far, I certainly can see some really interesting avenues that have opened up. So I have several questions that I'll put to our panel, and we can just explore some of these ideas that we have talked about over the course of the conference. Again, to refer, so first question, regarding putting together the different disciplines that we've tried to combine in the conference. We have quite a few people from theology, but we also wanted to include others from history, literature, a whole set of fields, because we thought that we would basically just get perspectives and ideas that way that we wouldn't otherwise have. But there's one tricky issue there in doing that, which is that historians, for example, often play according to different ground rules than theologians do. Theologians will, at least when they're working in a sort of constructive mode, operate on the basis of faith commitments, and typically historians will understand themselves to not be doing that, even qua historian. So I'm wondering if any of our panelists have thoughts on the best way to bring those disciplines into conversation, because I still am convinced that doing so is really profitable, and I think we've seen in this conference that it is profitable, but we've also seen that there are challenges in doing that. So I wonder if anyone would be interested in weighing in on that question, offering thoughts, reflections, grand solutions. I see Cyril's hand, so please go ahead.
It is true that the disciplines of history and theology are different, though it's not clear what the discipline of theology is. So it may not be one discipline. It is the case that there are very definite rules of evidence for history. Historians, no less than theologians, are going to have, or could have, faith commitments, and therefore sort of they are sort of going to be as normatively disposed as theologians. I take it, however, that the rules of evidence for a historian are somewhat different in the sense that it's not just simply that the normative matrix of the historian sort of is put in brackets, which I presume it is. But there also, I think, there's also a sense as to what the goal of history is. It seems to me sort of that we can make too little distinction between theology and history, but also too much. From my point of view, and I'm looking at Brad Gregory on the screen, who is my colleague, who lives 200 yards up the road. So Brad and I do very different things. I mean, I think I can read his stuff and he can read my stuff. So is the difference between Brad and I that I have more lax rules of evidence than he? That could be the case. In fact, one might even presume that be the case. And that sort of would get me exiled from one guild and would promote me perhaps in another. But I think that actually that may not be the distinction. When I do my work, let's say my genealogical work, I mean, I do maybe first level theological work. When I do my genealogical work, I kind of regard it as an ancillary enterprise on the one hand, and to some extent also an enterprise that functions on a kind of meta level. I'm declaring, when I am looking to prove something to be the case, right, or I think something is the case, let's say, we'll just think narrowly for the moment. When I wrote the Heterodox Hegel, I just saw that historians or people who are using Hegel or against Hegel presume that they had they got a clear notion as to what what Christianity is for Hegel. So therefore he either is a Christian or he ain't. This is the issue. And I thought, you know something, that is incredibly silly. Because Christianity is always constructed. So what's the construction of it, right? So I wrote the book going after a question. I'm a Christian, I'm a Catholic, but I went after a question that we were being, all of us, whether we were Christian or not Christian, whether we were left or right, we were simply being idiots with respect to a fundamental question which was never asked, right? So I did my analysis and I said, well, here is actually what the Christianity is and how it has been manufactured, right? And how it has been changed and rearranged and so forth. Now, I come out with a result that makes me look, or could make me look like a bigoted theologian. But I actually had put my Catholicism in brackets. But it was the question that I asked. I asked the question I was provoked by, Hegel says that he's doing Christianity, but sublating it. Well, sublating is a bad thing. It could be a bad thing. We could stop there. But my thing was, well, actually, before you get to sublation, maybe there's something else has gone wrong too, right? At least if he makes the claim it's Christian, then I have the right to pursue the question, right? I think that when I ask that question, that's a perfectly good enterprise. And I would suggest that my faith commitments were in as much parenthesis as Brad's. So we're not to assume that the distinction, my basic point is negative point. We can't assume all the time that theologians are those kind of persons who have more amorphous personalities, that their norms bleed into what they do, and historians, they don't. So if Brad can make the claim, and I think he can make the claim and sustain it, that for purposes of history, he puts in parentheses those claims. He's not denying that could be seeping through, and he may not know it, and the same with me. But I do think that theologians, when they do genealogies, also are making true claims. Now, whether those true claims are hubristic or whether they're more modest, or whether the conjectures, and Silvianne brought up a great point, and we can get to that in due course, I still think that the questions, the way the questions get asked, is probably more decisive than the assumption that, well, there's going to be a difference between the degree of normativity in terms of how the results are going to be shaped and how they're going to come out.
Okay, thank you, Cyril. I see hands from most of the panel, so I'm just going to start going around in the order of appearance of the hands. So to Peter Harrison next.
Thanks, Darren. Look, I mean, these are just some practical suggestions for how we move things along. And as I said right at the outset, I think we need a clearer understanding of what we mean by theological genealogy, because it admits of two immediately interpretations: a genealogy that involves fundamental invocation of the role that theology has played in getting us to where we are now, and the notion that there's normative theological commitment involved. And that then will actually break up into the two disciplinary groups. Say the historians are going to be doing the first kind and the theologians are going to be doing the second kind. So it'd be useful just to have a bit of analytic clarity, but presumably you asked us from these different disciplines because you had something in mind about something that was common. And so what's common? I mean, if I look at, if I look at, say, John Milbank's work and Brad Gregory's work, I come back to this distinction I've made between the logical and the normative. And let me be very clear what I mean by logical. I don't mean some neutral standpoint. I mean, what's the interest on both sides is to pointing out some of the it's about inconsistency. What's inconsistent about some of our modern institutions? And I see both normative theological genealogies doing that work and more neutral historical genealogies doing that work. And you can get that up and running, because I do think you can, although the lines are blurry, when I talk about the logical, I'm not talking about some Archimedean neutrality. I'm talking about, if you consider this thing on its own terms, here are the inconsistencies. And why are they inconsistent? Because they're resting on unexamined premises. And why are they? Because there's a historical account of that. I know we're getting into the problems with historical causation there. I take the cautions that Silvianne has, right? So that's where we are. So, and then thirdly, just one final thing, you know, I think in terms of the relations then between history and theology, and I must confess, I don't understand the ground rules for theology. I don't, but I do think that history can be a resource for theology. I'm not sure that it works the other way around, but that just could be my prejudice. So 3 things. Let's get clear what we mean by theological genealogies. I do think when I look at the different kinds that at least one thing in common is this question of bringing into question the consistency of particular institutions. And then thirdly, I do think we can think about the relation in terms of history as a resource for theology.
Just as a sidebar, I mean, I think it's absolutely important to get clarity on this terminology we've been using in Theological Genealogies of Modernity. I think another thing that terminology can use, just to comment on your first point, is it can refer to a genealogy of the discipline of theology itself. That was really what was going on in my paper. I mean, that was the concern that T.F. Torrance had. So it's the terminology that we've used as a title for the conference. I mean, it's very polyvalent for sure. Well, let me go to Johannes next.
Cool, thank you. And thank you, Darren, for the question. I feel I've spent half my life just thinking about that. So I have a few thoughts on it. I mean, at one level, I want to be a sort of almost old-fashioned, and I don't even know whether it's idealist or Aristotelian, and say knowledge is one. And so in a way, there can't be a categorical distinction unless we stop thinking of theology as in itself an intellectual pursuit. Of course, that doesn't mean that in today's world, academic disciplines haven't produced tons of specializations, and theology and history is sort of just the beginning, right? I mean, social and political historians find it often very difficult to talk to each other because they make different methodological assumptions. Exegetical and systematic theologians find it difficult. And to an extent, I think we shouldn't forget, which I suspect in a context like this one, it's very easy to forget, that institutional settings matter much more. It's not everything's just about intellectual trajectories. It's also about the way those of us, most of us who operate within a university, follow rules that are really set by the sort of institutional setup in which we're integrated. Anyway, I would say a few things which perhaps sound totally trivial, but in my experience aren't. I think being a theologian is no excuse for being a bad historian. And I think, well, I mean, I know, it sounds, Brad, you're right. I mean, it sounds ridiculous, but I feel I've heard so often in conversations between the two, say, oh, you're a historian, you may very well think that, but I happen to be an evangelical theologian, and I just think you're wrong. And I think that's kind of not a valid argument. Of course, at the same time, I think is also being a historian is also not an excuse of being a bad theologian. And I think it will be very easy to find a lot of examples for where that happens. So I think with all that, I haven't given a very clear answer to your question, Darren. Perhaps I may actually come back to one thing that Silvianne said in her beautiful paper. And I think, this idea of conjectural may actually be helpful. I think that if we were all able to an extent to operate in a dialogical fashion, and we'd be willing to listen to what other people say and be willing to correct our own positions if evidence demands it. So speaking from the person who, whatever his historical interest, at the end of the day, of course, earns his money in his theological faculty, talking to a colleague within history who tells me that certain things, yes, I know 30 years ago people believed that, but this is for the following reasons no longer really tenable. And then I do best to say, well, I go back and think about my own ideas in light of that and be grateful to being offered that guidance. So I think that because the ideal where there is a philosopher, a theologian who embodies this unity of knowledge is just no longer realistic if it ever was. I think being, talking to each other and being willing to listen to what other people have to say, even where it really sometimes hurts, may be pragmatically the best way forward we have.
And I think we've seen really good examples of that time and again in this conference. Even to the point of people being willing to be corrected by others. So I've appreciated people being willing to not only engage in cross-disciplinary dialogue, but take on points from others, even if they need to admit that they weren't quite exactly right to begin with. So that's a dynamic that I've appreciated in the conversations that we've had. But over to Pui for the next comment or reply.
Hi, thank you. I'll make 2 points here, which I think hopefully complements what has been said. The first point is that given the way that I have such an unusual background, having had a degree in physics and then philosophy and then patristics, my experience is that of these sort of disciplinary boundaries is resonating with me with Johannes's point. It's largely institutional, cultural, and so for somebody who's an outsider, who has no institutional, like for the rest of my academic training, basically, I've always been an outsider. Actually, these things are self-imposed a lot of the time, because I can tell when I subscribed to these things, there was a moment when suddenly it clicked, right? Whereas previously, because I wasn't trained in that discipline, certain things just never appeared to me to be a problem in terms of why is it that, historians have certain insistence about context, and why is it theologians have, a lot more freedom in terms of how they combine sources. For me, those things just happen, if they're useful. And then once you're in the institution for long enough, you realize that that has some sort of cultural value for the institution of history as a faculty, and then for theology, and then it becomes apparent to me that there is some sort of difficulty with making that transition. So that's my point, is that it seems to me that it's to do with institutional history and institutional understanding of how it functions as a community within institutions. You may have a university where the Department of History has a culture which is rather communally connected to the religious studies or theology department, and you may have other universities where this is not the case. So that's my first point. My second point is that it seems to me that from this conference, and I must confess that, as I said in my paper, I don't think, my take to the question of theological genealogy follows the traditional approach which people talk about, this category of write such narratives, that is, coming from a deep immersion of modern thought, modern philosophy and theology and history, in the case of Brad and Peter. And because I didn't come from this, it requires certain courage to tackle a topic from an outsider point of view, and it requires certain mastery of the sources as well, and narrowing the scope, etc. But my point here is to draw on that point of courage. There seems to be that if the theologian and the historian is to break through this and to make fruitful, as Peter said, resources of history is to become useful for the theologian, there needs to be a sense of apprenticeship. I actually work with scientists who want to learn theologian. That's what I do right now. And scientists is totally scared. They don't know anything about intellectual history in the 14th century till the 17th century. They don't know anything about, Peter's books are very easy to read in many ways because he doesn't kind of overload scientists with these kind of suppositions about intellectual context you're supposed to know about. And so it requires a lot of courage for these people that I work with who are scientists to actually come to learn theology and learn philosophy, and requires a lot of courage for them to write, for them to say anything, because, and for me, I think I see the same thing about theologians needing courage. And now I force myself to write projects where it has to speak to a historian with the highest, standard of, philological scholarship, because I knew that if I not do that, I won't be able to write anything that would make that conversation go, despite the fact that's not the main goal of my work, as I've tried to describe. I'll shut up here.
Over to Brad Gregory.
Thanks very much. I'm grateful for the comments that have preceded mine because they, I think, set up, and hopefully this will be useful as well. I want to make 3 points. The first is, as a historian and participating in this conference, I'm struck by the particularity of specifically of theological genealogies of modernity, of whatever sort, in relationship to, let's say, what I called on Thursday in my presentation, the I think much broader category of historical macro narratives on the one hand, but also I think different from non-theological genealogies of modernity. And by that I mean scholars, right, that have used specifically genealogical analysis to talk about the emergence of conceptions of race, nation, citizenship, the secular, even a classic work like Perry Anderson's Lineages of the Absolutist State is in important ways a kind of genealogical analysis of how we got the early modern absolutist state out of the feudal political institutions of the Middle Ages. Now, as far as what historians, I think many more historians need to take heed of, whether or not they are religious believers, indeed anyone needs to. If you want to understand anything about Western Europe between the later 4th century at the latest and the 19th century, that maybe you can stop then, I would say all the way up to the present, insofar as all accounts and analyses of secularization are parasitic, not just on religion in some generic sense, but specifically on Western Christianity in its Western context. Anybody who wants to understand much of anything about Western Europe from the late 4th century to the present has to understand something substantive about Latin Christianity, the Reformation era, Christianity since then. But per se, that imperative does not entail a theological genealogy, nor do I think it even entails any commitment to Christianity or any other faith for that matter. It's just a basic requirement of doing adequate history. Now, following something that Cyril said yesterday, I think part of it, and this is to Peter Harrison's point too, about getting clear in this analytical distinction between what historians are about and what theologians are about. Part of the difference, I think, between at least some theological genealogies and macro narrative histories is that, as Cyril said, right, the former seek not to explain, but in one sense or another to illuminate, right? And then the question is, what are we trying to illuminate with what priorities, what criteria, and so forth? Whereas the principal purpose of what historians do is to explain change over time. It's also, I think, one of our most challenging endeavors. And with all historical scholarship, this is why the question of, conjectural humility and so forth is just, it seems a bit odd to me. I mean, everything that historians do, this is just the nature of what it is we do. Everything we do is open to challenge, it's open to debate, counter evidence, conceptual inadequacies, you've overlooked this evidence, you've emphasized this too much, and so forth. I don't know of a single historian who thinks that her explanations are beyond critique or revision, whether at the macro level or the most granular microhistory. So as Silvianne rightly insisted, provisional, absolutely. Conjectural among historians has a quite different valence. It usually refers to something like, you know, these are people, illiterate people in the past, for example, that we have just absolutely no surviving sources for at all, that we can directly derive something from. However, we do know lots of things about the general material conditions of their life, the political context in which we were, and so we might want to conjecture about certain aspects of their lives. But conjectural in the sense of, oh, I'm humble, that really means go do some more work until you're confident enough to actually present an argument based on evidence. Right, second point. I think, how can I put this? There've been a number, this is hardly only our conference. Almost every academic conference I've ever been to, this is the case, right? Straw men are walking around. If one is going to make serious arguments or engage with the actual substance of those who make serious arguments, it's important to be aware of that and to avoid it. I deliberately opened my paper the way that I did by delineating the formal logical limiting cases of either macro narratives or theological genealogies, either of absolute total progress or absolute total decline, in order to say, okay, now that we have that out of the way, what are we really talking about? We're talking about everything in the middle of those. Nobody who is serious defends either a view of one extreme or the other. The question is always, which elements are included? How are they combined? What are our criteria for evaluation and so forth? And so I think it's unhelpful and too evasive to state or to imply that there are scholars who claim that everything about modernity is wrong or bad and so forth. At least I don't know any. Another straw man, this notion of the unavoidability of perspective, presuppositions, assumptions, and so forth. The question isn't whether some of those are necessary. Of course they are. The question is whether, if and in what ways are particular assumptions, presuppositions, and so forth problematic for the analysis that they're actually being used in. It's also possible that some assumptions and presuppositions might be positively generative, disclosive. Unless you have these presuppositions, you won't see certain things, you won't understand them well. And that's important to recognize too. In fact, in a different register, I think certain kinds of assumptions are absolutely epistemologically necessary. I mean, Silvianne made this point when she said, well, yeah, you can say, well, you know, we all have our perspectives, so, you know, let's just sit around and not do anything. No, I mean, that is just the epitome of intellectual laziness as a symptom of everything that's wrong with postmodernism. Final point, one of the reasons I think theologians and religious studies scholars, this is meant as a helpful comment. It's not meant as the indictment of an entire, way of complexly doing this kind of scholarship. But one of the reasons I think that theologians and religious studies scholars have difficulty getting traction among colleagues in other disciplines, and this goes to Johannes's point, right, about the institutional setting as well, is not just because all those other colleagues are secular, they don't care about what we do. It's partly of a pretty pronounced tendency, and I think we've seen it in various ways on display in this conference, is to turn discussions about matters of substance and interpretation of things in the past or out in the world into exclusively or too exclusively meta discussions among members of the guild. What do we really mean by X? What are the categories or the criteria for such and such? Now, it's not that those things are not important. They are important, but I'm saying that when they take over and crowd out a focus on what it is that we're ostensibly studying and trying to understand, we don't do ourselves, regardless of our field, any favors. This is back to the notion of opportunity costs. We can debate methods, concepts, implicit assumptions and so forth all day long. But I think this is in part what contributes sociologically to the perception in the public at large, unjustified though it may be, that academics in general, we're not just inhabitants of the proverbial ivory tower. We've locked ourselves into our preferential closets within it. We've closed the windows where we alternate between self-absorbed navel gazing and group therapy. Similarly, in a world where that's obviously, inescapably influenced, right, by hegemonic nation states, it's pervaded by global consumerist capitalism, it's marked by ubiquitous socioeconomic inequalities. It is constantly and rapidly being transformed by technological applications. It's characterized by open-ended pluralism, by multivalent anthropogenic environmental damage. In that world, to say, well, what really is modernity? Or, has it ever really happened? I mean, come on. to debate, are we in late modernity? Are we in post-modernity? When this is going on, really? That is quixotic, it's evasive, and for sure, it contributes to the low opinion that many of our scientists, our social scientist colleagues have of us as humanists, not to mention the low opinion of humanistic scholars in the wider public. Okay, declamation over.
Right. I'll just make a brief comment on the second sort of element of the declamation, which is just to say, I don't think all the academic work that happens is so excessively meta that it's not connected to reality. It's just that the university allows for those sorts of discussions that otherwise wouldn't have any place in which they could occur. At least that's how I would read things. I wonder if Silvianne wants to come in on the comments on conjecture. I mean, I took her to be saying that there's something about the scale and ambition of genealogies that mean that a stance of conjecture toward them is especially appropriate. Whereas if I write an essay on a tiny little fragment that's been discovered from Karl Barth, a bit of class notes that a student has left, and that just sheds a tiny little bit of light on one of his doctrines as it developed in the last year of his life. I mean, that sort of argumentation is still corrigible, but it's not conjectural in the same way that Silvianne was suggesting. At least that's the way I took her. I don't know if she's welcome to comment on that. She doesn't need to.
I mean, Brad, what goes through my head when I listen to you is that there are just times when we can't just say, let's do more work, because our life is limited. Otherwise we just end up doing nothing. So that's the sort of stance, you know, you cannot, I mean, I take it you are enormously well read, Laconia, your background, of course, but none of us can be an expert in everything. And I agree with Darren that was exactly sort of my point. There's something about genealogies which requires you to have an opinion about more things than you humanly can.
Can I just come back on that? I mean, I agree completely. I'm not denying that whatsoever. So here's the question then. When I'm writing about something other than the late Middle Ages of the Reformation era, I am opening myself up to critique from experts in all the fields of which I'm not an expert. Bring it on. You know, that's what you do. If you dare to do something more, then, you know, I'm really going to get it right about Karl Barth's notes in relationship to this passage, right, in his you know, Werke or whatever. Okay, great. Well, bring on the critiques then. You have to be both. I wouldn't do it, I mean, unless I was obviously confident in thinking that the kinds of claims that I'm making will hold water. I'm not willingly opening myself up to, right, devastating critique from experts. You have to do a lot of work. You also have to be incredibly careful about exactly how you couch and what you say about the things, particularly outside your field of expertise. And I don't think that's an insuperable challenge. That's where the modesty comes in. Don't pretend you know the specifics about 1930s fascism, right? In a comparative Italian, Spanish, and German context when you don't. It doesn't mean you can't say anything about those regimes. It means you have to be incredibly careful and mindful about how you say what it is that you claim. That's all.
John Milbank has been waiting patiently with his hand raised, so I'd welcome him to come in.
Thank you. Attributing a lot of virtue to me here, but maybe not. But everybody's had 3 points, so I've also got 3 points, and I'm going to try and make them really, really quick. So first of all, I think it's important to address this issue about genealogy and causality that Silvianne has so very, very rightly raised. Because I would say that genealogists are quite skeptical about causality, that if they have a model of causality, it's more a narrative one than a mechanical one. So if you're reading a story, then you have to assume certain things that have gone before. But whether causality is at work is not completely clear. In fact, I would go so far as to say that metaphysically, I think effects can be in excess of their cause or have no cause. For example, the First World War, it's not clear to me that in the end you can explain the First World War. The sheer happening of the First World War is maybe more occasioned than finally caused. So, you know, what would a genealogist have to say then about the First World War? Well, nothing as regards causality, but as regards the kind of event that the First World War is. In other words, the assumptions about what a war is, what a state is, you know, what the criteria for a war is, and what's going on in a war are obviously massively different from the chivalric warfare of the Middle Ages. And so behind those assumptions, you can trace something that we can roughly call a genealogy. You know, you can track it back to a series of alterations in mentality, if you like to put it that way. So I think it's at that kind of level that's, you know, inherently very conceptual, even though that, because a mentality affects events as well as things going on in books. I think it's that kind of level that the genealogist is concerned with. My second remark would be what brings together, you know, theological genealogies of modernity, whether we're talking about Charles Taylor, MacIntyre, myself, Ivan Illich, all sorts of other people. It seems to me, roughly speaking, it's questioning the idea of the naturalness of secular modernity. It's questioning the idea, if you like, of the immanence, secularity, the rule of reason without faith is a sort of natural residue. And therefore, in a sense, you don't have to historicize it because it's what's left over when you remove all the crap, when you're emancipated from all the nonsense. So that's what a theological genealogy is questioning. And actually, an atheist could accept it. You know, an atheist of a Nietzschean kind could very well accept that. They could say, actually, it's not innocent at all, and we can see certain specific constructions going on in the secular that may themselves be quasi-religious, quasi-theological, and so on. And so Taylor sort of traces secularity actually to changes in religious practice themselves, rather than attributing secularity to the removal of superstition or something like that. Now, I completely agree with both Johannes and Brad. Those claims have to be empirically tested. There's no question about that. You have to run them through all the texts and all the events and so on, and it doesn't matter what you call yourself. They've got to be empirically defensible. Absolutely. So, you know, the role of the historian, and we've all got to be historians in that sense, is paramount. But then the third point I would make is that I'm skeptical about any final division between the historian and the theological historian or the philosophical historian if we come to the level of particularly big history. You know, if we're looking at Gibbon or Brodal or indeed Perry Anderson, it's clear they've got agendas, you know, and at that kind of level, at least, never mind any other level, you can't make any total separation between your assumptions and your values and the empirical claims you're making. It doesn't mean that you're not answerable to the evidence, but there is no pure evidence free of interpretation, and that becomes even more true at that kind of meta level. So I suppose I would want to argue, maybe Johannes was pointing in that direction, that the theological genealogist is on a direct level playing field with these other big meta-historical claims. And maybe that debate has not fully happened yet, and trying to make that kind of debate happen, trying to make, theological genealogies, even Charles Taylor, perhaps, rather less marginal than they have been, would be important. That's all.
Silvianne, your hand is up. Is that a residual hand or is that a fresh hand?
It's a fresh hand
Okay, please.
John, I think what you just said about that your kind of genealogy is more interested in a narrative model of causality.
Yeah.
That interests me, and I would like you to explain that a bit more, because I think it's not, I don't buy it that you are not interested in causality. But
no,
so
I didn't quite say that. I said that actually I'm skeptical about the usual models of causality in general. I think that history really happens according to something more like a narrative model, and things are often underdetermined. And there is no easy distinction to be made between a cause and an effect. If you look at Aristotelian models of causality or Neoplatonic models of causality, they're totally different to us. And I think they're nearer to, they're more accurate in both in terms of physical and historical explanation, but that would be, a long philosophical discussion. But I definitely reject the usual models of causality people are operating. But so did Nietzsche. And sorry, you can't come back, Silvianne, if you will. You're muted.
Okay, I think the next hand was that of Brad Gregory.
Yeah, just very quickly, and again, so many of the great issues we've raised, right, could be the subjects for an entire conference themselves. The question about, and Peter can jump in on this as well if he'd like to. The question about historians and causality, I think a lot of non-historians have a misguided idea about the way historians think of causality. Sort of like, we're kind of applying Hume's skepticism about causality to, it's like this event happens and then there's that effect. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Incredibly few historians, particularly those who I would say are on the more humanistic side of the historical discipline, argue in those ways.
Yeah, no,
we're right. much more attuned to the complexity of the past, process, not discrete events for the most part. Things are complicated and connected, and that, of course, points to what John was saying about the crucial importance of narrative, which doesn't mean you're not dealing with causes, or I would say human actions in all their complexity. It's just that when you have lots and lots of human actions, agglutinatively, right, complicatedly related, it's gonna be very difficult to tell a convincing story. And of course, it's always open to correction and critique. On the social scientific side of the historical discipline, however, that's a different kettle of fish. Those people really are, in some cases, interested in testing his hypotheses under social scientific criteria. They specify really quite rigorously, the parameters of their variables and so forth, and they want to understand. I'm thinking of people like Ian Morris, like Walter Scheidel, both at Stanford, both great ancient historians who are interested in the very longue durée and the transformation of change over time. So anyway, historians are not naive about causality. That's all I wanted to say.
Okay, I see several other hands, so I'll keep going around to Johannes Zachhuber.
Yeah, I think this is really a fascinating sort of side debate here. But I do also wonder whether causality is the most helpful term to use, because the example John gave earlier, which I thought was a very good one, right? You take an event such as the First World War and you ask what caused it. And we all know in the philosophy of history, that's kind of long-standing conundrum that obviously, because we don't have counterfactual history, we can't really ultimately tell which of the myriad factors actually caused it. But I do wonder whether when we talk about genealogies, we're not actually talking about something very different. Again, fair enough, John made that point. But I still wonder whether there isn't something sort of to disagree on. And what's to disagree on is to what extent, again, it's a dangerous term, but I'm tempted to use the term determinism. over against freedom. I mean, that's, I made that point in my response to Silvianne earlier. It seems to me for Nietzsche, that was an absolutely crucial point. That's why he was so much opposed to the sort of historicism of his own time, because he felt that the historians would build up this amazing narrative, and it would essentially suggest to individuals that they kind of, whether they liked it or not, they just had to march in that direction. And of course, that's something that's also to an extent happening in our own time, whereas I think there is the kind of Nietzschean genealogy is consciously pushing against that and consciously trying to sort of carve out a space where a kind of alternative agency becomes possible. And so I think that's not, I mean, of course we can say determinism also has something to do with causality, but I think it is it's a sort of different category of problem. And I'm sure Brad and Peter could tell me that I get some internal debates within among the historical guild wrong. But it seems to me it's a serious problem. It's not just sort of a made up problem. I mean, to an extent, if someone writes about the Reformation, if someone writes about modern democracy, if someone writes about, I mean, even the world wars in the 20th century, there is a sort of implicit teleology, right? I mean, what are all these stories telling us? And to an extent, that very often seems to imply that we are essentially part of a more or less deterministic trajectory.
Christine Helmer, you've got your hand up.
Thank you. I appreciate this discussion on how the theological imagination is deployed in this transhistorical storytelling, and I think that is one of the advantages of being a theologian, is that one can use the imagination to tell better stories with historical empirical verification. But at the basis, it really does require an imaginative sweep that also, I think, erodes this, what I think to be an artificial distinction between theological normativity and historical description. I mean, I think that claims about sort of the self-involving performances of identity would erode that artificial distinction. I think historians can be normative and theologians are definitely descriptive, at least as Schleiermacher advocated. So I think that the imagination and the meta level reflection on one's own self-involving performances, for example, this discussion, I think would be really interesting to look at how confessional identities are being deployed in the sort of construction of different theological genealogies. But I would like to end on what I heard from Cyril as what is the use? What is the goal of a theological genealogy? And I think there one can also have a theological commitment. Is the goal for the flourishing of the church, for the directing of church leadership in order to lead the church into the future? Is it for our colleagues in the humanities and the social sciences to give them a theological underpinning to what they are discussing? So, what's the point? And is it one that would give us the imaginative resources to live now in the sort of ruins, in the capitalistic ruins? I think there are these edifying, imaginative goals or purposes of theological genealogy that also involve theological commitments.
Okay, let's see. I'm going to go to Cyril, who has also been waiting for a while, and then after Cyril to Judith. So Cyril, please.
This might be 2 points, so I'm breaking sort of from the triad. I want to get back to conjecture, and there was some worries about language, not about intent, and suggest that maybe sort of we can resituate conjecture and make it work actually a little bit better than otherwise it might. That's going to be my first point. My second point has got to do, I think, with the notion of narration and whether sort of the relationship between macro history and theological genealogy might very well be closer than macro history is to other kinds of history, including the kind of quantitative history that Brad's been talking about. So let me just get to the first point. On one of the days, probably the day of my paper, I started out with a negative statement. So it's got point one. I said that theological genealogies are not explanatory. By that, of course, I mean that you're not going to have enough evidence. It is not in a causal nexus, at least not properly. Though, of course, if you narrate their agent-like properties, that is, when you're talking about what follow what, you're saying that they follow not merely in the sequence, but they follow in the sequence such that what you're mentioning last somehow or other presupposes all those other stages. So the order of agent-like presupposition, or that beginning, you have a beginning, you have an end, and you can't reverse them, that I think is essential. I wanted to call that, however, I said it's not explanatory, that's the negative side of it. I use the kind of middling term, you're involved in illumination. That is, that there's something to be said with respect to these agent-like properties that illuminate your present circumstances, given your interests, right? And there can be different kinds of interests served. Let me just use another word, which I think will also be the word that will get us into narration. That what you're doing is that you're involved not in an explanatory network, you're involved in a rhetorical network. You're involved in the network of persuasion with respect to this is who we are. First of all, understand this is who we are. And we came to be this who we are because of this. You're trying to persuade people who might not be aware that they are who they are. And if they are aware of who they are, they might just think of it as fate. And you want to say, no, you came to be this kind of thing. And we're talking about, well, one of the things you do is you say that who you are is contingent on this. And that leaves the space of freedom as to whether you like that particular result or not, and whether you're interested in changing it. So I think rhetoric is probably what we do. I think what is going to be the case in a macro history, at least what I understand Brad to be going to do with this next huge project, it will have quasi-causal features. That is, the narration is going to have a sequence. There's going to be a set of presuppositions. One thing will presuppose the other, and of course, you're not going to be able to dot it. The larger the story, the more nebulous the kind of agent-like or causal-like features are going to be, the smaller, obviously, they're going to be accentuated. The second point I think I want to make is that, and this relates to that then, if all these macro narrations, whether theological or otherwise, are going to be in the order of rhetoric and the order of persuasion, is this a good story with sufficient evidence to persuade, but never enough evidence? Because I think Silvianne is right, it would have to be the God point of view, that you have all the evidence, and therefore you actually do get to the causal nexus, etc. I think one of the things that then we have to understand is, what is a good story? And of course, we don't know beforehand what a good story is. But of course, if the story is a story of assertion, and not a story of where the narrator is standing back like a novelist, and if you're showing how things happen and unfold. In other words, there's also the constraint and the patience of how to tell the story. And you tell this particular story, and this gets back, I think, to the notion of conjecture. I would think that it's not conjectural. It's a form of rhetorical persuasion, which is making a true claim, right? So in that sense, it's not conjectural in the sense that, well, I don't know what the truth is. No, you are asserting what the truth is under the proviso of revisability, I think Brad said. And so therefore that the conjectural nature of this kind of act of persuasion, the conjectural level is second level. It's not first level. That is, you're not behaving like a scientist necessarily, insofar as this is my conjecture and take it or leave it. You're making a true claim with evidence that you're hoping to be persuasive, but we all know, given the largeness of the thing, is you're in persuasion, you're not actually in demonstration. So, and one of the things that stands out to me, just in terms of making sure we have a figure who gets this right, I think is Newman in the 19th century. Newman understands himself always to be telling stories of some sort or other. And of course, they're counter stories, right? With respect to liberalism, what we might call secularity and its seepage into Anglican religion in the first instance. But what he says at times, he always understands what he's doing. And he suggests that when you claim to be a rhetorician, you're not claiming to be a magician. You're putting forth an argument, which is making a claim to truth. But the evidence that you sort of that you might think to be sufficient, or you think that having abstracted yourself and sort of let the story unfold, evidence unfold, should be sufficient. He says, well, in the last instance, my sufficiency with respect to evidence may not in fact prevail. And that means that all macro narratives, historical, theological, are primed to failure because the kind of evidence that you're going to be able to bring forward is a function of the story that you're going to tell, and vice versa. And to use John's term, some of these stories maybe have thick kinds of evidence, and they're the best kind of stories. There will be sort of a relative level of thickness or thinness. Thin stories cannot persuade. Thick stories can persuade, but even thick stories can fail to persuade because of the presuppositions of the persons you're trying to persuade, right? So built into it, it seems to me, so that in the act of persuasion, we understand how rhetoric works. You do your best job. You think you do a superb job. You've got great evidence, and the other guy has very little evidence at all, right? So that, it's really a dollar, so that it's not just moving, and you will not persuade. So there is this, I think, in terms of both an academic doing a macro history, but a theologian who wants to persuade and sort of is very interested in that persuasion. The persuasion in the genealogy is always primed in the end to failure, though it doesn't necessarily always fail.
Judith.
Thank you. I completely agree with Cyril about the mode of genealogy being the persuasive mode rather than the micro-historical one. And I think that leads very nicely to Christina's point, which I want to echo because I think it's an extremely important one, that the main aim of genealogy in many ways is a liberation to some kind of action in the present. We tell these stories both when we tell genealogies of a particular concept, a concept that people now take for granted, but which when put in a larger perspective actually looks different or has different roots than people expect, or when we put forward the grand theological genealogies of modernity. What we're trying to do is to liberate people or to orient people to act in a particular way in the present. And whether a genealogy is successful or not, in a sense, doesn't depend so much on whether it gets the story exactly right. Of course, it won't get the story exactly right. It's a story. It's, we tell just so stories. Some of them capture more of the web of reality than others. But not even a God's eye view would reveal the right genealogy, because I really don't think that there is such a thing, because things are just too interrelated. But we tell these stories in order to enable people to act. So I think it's a very interesting question, what kind of movement within the present a genealogy like John's or like Brad's encourages, and what the dangers and the potentials are of the ways in which they make us move in the present. And that's something that we should be discussing much more, I think, but haven't really so far. And I think Christina is trying to encourage us to pivot towards that. I do think that that's a really important avenue for question in the if we want to take this subject forward.
Okay, so encouraging us to think more about the implications for action that these stories have, without failing to care about the truthfulness of the story.
Yeah, and so
I think that's.
And I absolutely agree. Genealogies are closer to the macro histories of a Macaulay or a Gibbon or something than to micro histories. They're also closer to metaphysical systems. I mean, a theological genealogy of modernity is, in a sense, a historical account of a historical metaphysics, and I would say the same thing for metaphysical constructs as I would for genealogical ones, that they orient us, they give us a space within which to orient ourselves in our thinking and in our action, rather than necessarily getting the metaphysical shape of the world right, because that's really beyond us.
Pui, you've been waiting for a while as well.
Thank you. My point follows on Judith's point. I know Ragnar can't appear here, but this is Ragnar's point really. And I'm just trying to give an example. I mean, Ragnar's point at the end of his paper basically mentions his reservation about genealogy as forcing the audience to live in a kind of abstract space, an abstract space of reality that doesn't quite yet exist, or the road not taken is not really something that is real in the present. And as a result, if I understood him correctly, he thinks that this mode of persuasion perhaps may not be as effective as achieving the purpose of liberation to action, in the sense that to encourage action that radically subvert the kind of assumptions or the kind of frame that we live within modernity, because we are still kind of suspended somewhere in some virtual space. I think that's the term he used, which still is operating within certain categories, reason and distinction between science and religion, etc. It's just another virtual version of it. And he suggests at the end that perhaps radical practice, in the sense of, just within the present, that, and I'll give an example in a minute, that will actually directly subvert these assumptions that we live within. So I'll go to the science religion example in a minute. That actually breaks that modernity's assumption. It will be more effective to liberate people to action, because it actually forces the audience to be grounded in the present by dealing with this example right in front of you. And my example, it's very out of the way one. That's what I've been thinking about. The Russian genius Pavel Verlensky. Because Verlensky argues, and he gave a genealogy, in fact, of how he thinks about reason from Kant. But what is interesting about Verlensky, for those of you who know, is that he was recognized by the Soviet authority, a living authority on scientific research. And to the extent that he proposes in his famous argument, the pillars on the ground of truth, that it is actually a reason assisted by faith or regulated by faith that does more liberative work for reason, versus the kind of rationalism that he was attacking in. He has a kind of radical breaking through in his own practice of manifesting a kind of paradox, if you like, of how, for his audience, which was, early 20s and 30s Russia, to the extent that he wasn't exiled and he wasn't executed until late, because he was so productive in his research that they didn't want to, stop it. And of course, I mean, you can argue that the mode of persuasion was limited, and you could argue that, what has happened after Verlensky was executed. But my point here is that the mode in which he exhibited that possibility of liberating somebody to conduct scientific research in a different way shows an alternative, the kind of thing I imagine Ragnar to be saying, but I don't want to speak for Ragnar here. So that's one example.
I see Ragnar here. I don't know if he wants to come in. He's welcome to if he would like to. His work has been mentioned and has prompted discussion. So he's welcome to come in. If others have, let's see, just trying to manage the sort of Brady Bunch scene that I have of all the faces. So Johannes, your hand is up. Over to you.
Just thought that we're possibly getting to the point where we're all agreeing too much, so I thought I'd stir the pot. So I have to say that, if I had to sort of just put my cards on the table and say, why do I sometimes disagree or even kind of react against certain genealogists, I would say it's less probably necessarily a certain assertive style, which I think, may just be necessary to make a point that hasn't previously been made. I'm also actually quite forgiving when it comes to being really determined on a point, even though, obviously everybody knows that 20 years later, we'll have to move on. My biggest problem, I suspect, is that I find very often these genealogies only work by sort of scapegoating individuals in the past. And that is something, and that is, I mean, I kind of would like to know what people, perhaps especially those who engage in that trade, think about, you know, whether that is actually, and you know, in some ways, whether it is Scotus or Luther or Kant or I don't know, I mean, probably any other number of people, you know, somebody really has to turn up or has to be turned into a real baddie. And so I do wonder whether that people think that is a sort of necessary aspect of how genealogies, theological genealogies work, or whether there is a way. I mean, you know, it's just, you think differentiation is possible in many ways, but there always has to be one person where any differentiation comes to an end.
Good story needs a villain. I see John Milbank would like to respond to that one. There we go, unmuting himself. Still muted, still muted.
Okay. Is that right?
There we are.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. I'd like to say something about Johannes's worry and then about Pui's comments. First of all, I think what Johannes is saying, for me, it's just a complete red herring. It's never a matter of identifying villains, and the kind of genealogical processes that one traces. Yeah, sometimes somebody might be quite pivotal. You know, there are very, very good reasons why Duns Scotus is seen as pivotal, and the people who've identified him as pivotal, people like Werner Honefelder, and more recently, in fact, Jürgen Habermas himself, they're usually doing so because they want to praise him and see him as the long-term progenitor of something that will finally issue with Kant. So the people who are skeptical about modernity are typically saying, yes, but the moves that Scotus is making are not primarily philosophical, they're primarily theological. And so if you want to see his moves towards university, the formal distinction, knowledge as representation, the priority of possibility, etc., if you want to see them as rational advances, that's questionable if they're rooted in particular theological decisions and if they're inseparable from those decisions. And that's certainly not something that, say, primarily somebody like me is saying, who is not a medievalist. This is something that medievalists are saying, but that I think the huge consequences of that have to be considered. But, you know, if we're going to talk about Scotus, he doesn't stand alone. He assumes Avicenna, he assumes Henry of Ghent, and he's only important because actually, as somebody like Jean-Francois Courtine says, almost everybody, including most Thomists, then accept that at a semantic level, meaning is fundamentally univocal. And this totally transforms how they understand analogy and how Aquinas had understood analogy. So that it's not a matter of finding a villain. This would be ludicrous. It's his traceable actual impact within, you know, the story of medieval thought. That you know, that's the reason for the interest in something like that. But you know, very often it's not a matter of one person, but of a simultaneous shift that you can trace across lots of different thinkers. So the issue you're raising for me, you know, I'll just be blunt and frank, it's a non-issue.
Well, I'm glad we disagree, John. I was worried about agreeing too much today.
You couldn't deal with that. Okay, we're allowed to agree. I'm fine about us agreeing. Let's just carry on agreeing, you know? Why not? Anyway, Silvianne, not Silvianne, sorry, Pui is raising a very important point. but I think it's significant that he said that, you know, the great Florensky had both things going on. So you know, my simple answer would be genealogy isn't the whole game. It never is. It's not in my work. It shouldn't be for anybody. But that if, say, you're talking about what is science, you can't separate science as, you know, Peter Harrison's work has explained so well. You can't separate what is science from the story of the way since Whewell there came to be something called science. It's a very particular, specific phenomenon that's still around. But because it's ongoing, you're not just talking about its past, you're talking about something that's continuously developing. So that what I tried to say about my paper in the genetic fallacy, to the extent, in the sense that I don't think it's a fallacy, is you can't separate how a thing now is from the way it's come to be. This is, we live in time. You know, the present moment has already gone. It only was a succession of the past moments, etc. You know, so that, you know, talking ahistorically is in that sense going to be an illusion, and any theory always has a concealed narrative attached to it, that the things go together, as I tried to say in my paper. So, but then, okay, once you've tried to understand what science is now, and it's how science works now from how it has worked and how it came to be, are inseparable because of the way time is complex. It's ecstatic. You know, we can't separate the past of a thing from the present of a thing. You have to deal with them both together. But then finally, of course, the issue is, how do we deal with science now, and the issue of science and religion now? But if Pui is suggesting that Ragnar is saying, well, we could just sort of avoid the genealogical moment, I don't think that's right. And on your evidence, Florensky himself doesn't do that, but he definitely doesn't stop there. And there I totally agree with you, that, and I agree with what Christine is saying as well, that, you know, the final issue is what this implies for us now. And for example, how we're going to engage with science and religion now, how are we going to deal, you know, with the huge damage our technologism is doing now, and what does religion and theology have to say to that? Yeah, in the end, we have to go right beyond genealogy. That's correct.
Brad, Gregory.
Yeah, sorry, really briefly, Johannes, also, I disagree with that. Identification of villains and whatnot, twofold. One person's, this is a more trivial point, one person's villain is another person's hero in ways that John was just talking about. Yes, SCOTUS, huge influence, but, you know, for certain people, fantastic. I mean, this is Blumenberg also. Yeah, the legitimacy of the modern age. Good. These things happened in the late Middle Ages, and thank goodness they did. You know, this is Walter Scheidel, too, in his huge book, right, Up from Rome. Good thing that the Roman Empire was dissipated and everything, because you know why? It eventually led to liberal modernity, and that's great. Mm-hmm. So the value pluralism, the radically different evaluative criteria that are an incontestable, obvious part of our daily existence means that people are going to identify different people with a different positive or negative valence. But the real point is that all individuals act in the world in one way or another, but some people's influence ends up being much more impactful than others. Not because it had to be, not because it was fated. I mean, you know, less than 1% of the population could even read what SCOTUS wrote, let alone the fact that it wasn't actually being published in books, right, until centuries later. So, you know, there's no fatedness to it. The question is, who in fact has had a disproportionately influential, right, role in the making of things? The fact that the entire history of humanity overwhelmingly is colored by, shaped by, as Christine pointed out in her presentation, an overwhelming patriarchy, not to say misogyny, means that the overwhelming majority of the influential individuals in most cultures and most civilizations of the past are going to be men. Recognizing that doesn't make one misogynist or erasing women from history, What it does is recognize who, in fact, was more influential than others under the actual real lived human conditions as we can reconstruct it and understand it.
Johannes, would you like to come back at all?
Sure, I respectfully disagree, but I'm sure there must be another time to discuss that. I think that absolutely. I mean, if we look, I mean, you know, one person's a villain is another person's hero, and we look at, let's say, you know, to Brad, the Reformation expert. I mean, we look at Luther perceptions in German nationalism in the 19th century. I mean, that is also deeply problematic. But you know, one wrong doesn't improve another one. And I think that people, in my view, have to ask themselves to what extent that's something that's going on. And I mean, you know, I ask this as an open question. I'm of course willing to be persuaded this is wrong. But as a theologian and as someone who's worked on theological history, you know, there are also many other stories that you could easily cite that are not directly connected with theological genealogy. You look at a figure like Arius in the 4th century, and I mean, there is a pattern where identifying a hugely divisive turn with an individual isn't something that's innocuously done. And I think to pretend that a historian essentially all they're doing is essentially just analyzing the sources there and not also feeding narratives of identity, which are also narratives of exclusion, well, that is naive in my view.
I think I'm going to give Johannes the last word here, partly just for practical reasons, because it is 1:36 a.m. here in Melbourne, where I am located. And I have the sense that this discussion could go on for quite some time. So I'm just going to be sort of arbitrary and end it here. But I want to thank all of you for participating in the conference. I mean, Pui and I spent some time planning it, and it just has come together as well as we could have hoped and better. We've drawn a few threads together here at the end of the conference. There's certainly lots more interesting discussions that can come out of this, and I hope to see those of you who've been involved writing on these sorts of topics and others as well, for sure. So I just want to thank the sponsors, those who ran things behind the scenes, and those of you who participated in the conference itself. It's been a joy to be a part of it and very illuminating. So with that, I'm going to sign off and look forward to the things that will come out of this work that we've done here today.